Two people can have the exact same blood pressure reading, down to the decimal. One is told they're healthy. The other is told they have a chronic disease. Same number, same arteries, same morning. If you want, two completely different verdicts. That's not a thought experiment. That's real, for millions of Americans. Right now, if you're over 40, there's a real chance you're one of them, and you don't even know it yet. So, what's actually different between those two people? Not their blood, not their heart, nothing a needle or a skin could ever find. Something else happened. Something that had nothing to do with their body at all. And by the time this is over, you'll know exactly what it was, because it's already happened to 31 million Americans, and almost none of them noticed. Here's the answer nobody expects. It wasn't a needle. It wasn't a scan. It wasn't a single new symptom. It was a piece of paper. In 2017, a panel of doctors moved the line that defines high blood pressure. Nothing about anyone's arteries changed that year. What changed was the target, and the moment it moved. 1 million Americans who'd been normal the day before technically became hypertensive. Mystery solved. Not even close, because that same era, something almost identical happened to the definition of high cholesterol. And two prediabetes. 3 separate conditions. 3 separate panels of experts. Millions of Americans were classified in each one, without a single biological test ever changing what it measures. A disease, in theory, is something your body does. A narrowing artery, a struggling pancreas, a heart working harder than it should. Turns out that's not the whole story. A diagnosis is also a decision, and somewhere, someone keeps redrawing the line. That's not automatically a scandal. Every field revises its definitions as evidence comes in, but it leaves 3 questions hanging, and none of them have easy answers. Why did these lines move? Who decided where to put them? And did moving them save a single life? To find out, we have to open the files, one at a time, starting with the one that started it all. Start with the file that reclassified 31 million people, because it's the clearest case and the strangest. We already know the headline. In 2017, a panel from the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology the target for high blood pressure from 140/90 down to 130/80. Nothing about anyone's arteries changed that year. Only the number did. Here's what we don't know yet. Why? Not arbitrarily. It turns out the panel was leaning on a major clinical trial. Thousands of adults at high cardiovascular risk split into 2 groups. One treated down to under 140. The other pushed more aggressively, under 120. The results were hard to argue with. The intensively treated group had noticeably fewer heart attacks, strokes, cases of heart failure. But there's one number that actually moved the committee. When researchers counted deaths from any cause at all, that same group had roughly 27% fewer. Not a rounding error. One of the more striking mortality numbers in recent cardiovascular research. There's a catch, though. That trial didn't test everyone. It excluded people with diabetes. It required a level of monitoring most doctors' offices simply don't have, which means the strongest evidence applies to the sickest, highest risk patients, and gets considerably murkier for someone quietly sitting at 130 to over 85 with nothing else going on. If that sounds closer to your numbers than a hospital bed, keep listening. This next part is for you. And here's the twist almost nobody mentions. The rest of the world looked at that exact same trial. The UK kept its diagnostic line at 140/90. So did the major European cardiology societies. So did Canada for most of the population. Same data, same year, different verdict on opposite sides of an ocean, which means the real story of the blood pressure file is just the evidence changed. It's that American medicine chose to interpret that evidence more aggressively than almost anywhere else on earth. One file down, two to go, and the next one has an urban legend hiding inside it. You've probably heard this one. Normal LDL cholesterol used to be 190. Then, in 2001, it quietly dropped to 130, as if tens of millions of people's arteries changed overnight. Here's the problem. It isn't true. Not the way it sounds. In 1988, 190 was never the definition of normal. It was the number at which doctors were told to start considering medication, and only after diet changes had already failed. The actual desirable range, even back then, was already under 130, so the target barely moved. What moved was how aggressively doctors were told to act on it. By 2001, guidance tightened further for people already at real risk, under 100 for high-risk patients, under 130 for moderate. Then, in 2013, the same two organizations behind the blood pressure change did something nobody saw coming. They stopped chasing a single LDL number altogether. Instead, calculate a patient's 10-year cardiovascular risk score score crossed 75%, and a statin enters the conversation, regardless of what the cholesterol number actually says. That's a distinction most retellings of this story skip. The 2013 change didn't invent a new diagnosis called high cholesterol, it changed who qualified for treatment. But the ripple effect was real. Statin prescriptions in the U.S. nearly doubled in the first half of the 2000s, from around 90 million to 174 million. Not overnight, but across roughly 5 years, driven by new trial data, aggressive marketing, and shifting guidance landing all at once. There's a decent chance one of those bottles was sitting in your medicine cabinet or your parents'. Here's where the trail runs cold, though. You may have seen a very specific number attached to 2013, millions supposedly newly diagnosed with high cholesterol the instant the guideline dropped. We went looking for where that number came from. It doesn't exist. No credible data set supports it. Somewhere between the real story and the retelling, someone invented a statistic, and it stuck. 2 files closed, 1 left. And this next one isn't about an old disease getting redefined. It's about a disease category that didn't exist at all a few decades ago. Go back far enough, and prediabetes simply wasn't something you could be diagnosed with. The category first appeared in the late 1990s, when the American Diabetes Association defined impaired fasting glucose, a warning zone sitting between normal blood sugar and full diabetes. In 2003, they lowered the entry threshold from 110 down to 100 milligrams per deciliter. 10 points, that's it. That's all it took to pull millions more people across the line. Between 2010 and 2013, they added a second way in entirely, a blood test called A1C, with a range of 57 to 64%. Each change, on its own, was incremental, reviewed, and adjusted over roughly a decade, not signed into existence in one sitting, but stack them together, and the effect is enormous. Today, the CDC estimates that around 115 million American adults carry the prediabetes label. If a doctor has ever used that word with you, you're not alone, not even close. Now here's the detail that should change how you think about that number. Prediabetes isn't a disease the way a heart attack is a disease. It's a probability, a flag that says you're statistically more likely than average to develop diabetes later. Most people who get that flag never do. Somewhere between 5 and 10% convert to full diabetes each year. Plenty of others stay exactly where they are indefinitely. Some drift back to completely normal glucose levels without ever being treated at all. So, does the label help, or does it just quietly frighten 115 million people for nothing? This is where the evidence actually gets encouraging. Structured lifestyle programs, modest weight loss, regular movement, dietary change, meaningfully cut the odds that someone with prediabetes goes on to develop the real thing. That's the strongest argument for the category existing at all. It hands people a window to change course before anything is actually broken. But notice what's doing the work in that sentence. It isn't the label, it's what happens after it. 3 files, 3 different stories, which raises a question none of them answer on their own. Who exactly gets to decide where these lines go? Every one of these decisions came from an expert panel, which means every one of these decisions came from people, and people have interests. Look at who sat on the 2013 cholesterol panel, and a specific number jumps out. 8 of its 16 members had some financial relationship with pharmaceutical companies, consulting fees, research funding, speaking arrangements. The 2017 blood pressure panel had ties of its own, including its chair, who'd had past consulting relationships with drug companies. Sounds damning. Here's the catch. It isn't proof of anything. There's no paper trail showing a specific cutoff was chosen because of a specific financial relationship. The conflicts were disclosed, not hidden. Having a consulting arrangement with a drug company doesn't automatically mean a researcher's judgment was bought. But sit with the optics for a second. These are panels deciding who counts as sick, decisions that directly expand the market for entire classes of medication, and half the people on at least one of those panels had a financial relationship with the industry that stood to benefit. That's not a smoking gun. It's a legitimate, still open question, and it's exactly the kind of detail that makes a reasonable person suspicious, whether or not it actually changed a single number on a page. So, if the paper trail on motive runs cold here, where does the rest of the explanation come from? Follow the money, and you land on an unresolved question. Follow the population instead, and something far more concrete is waiting. While committees were redrawing lines on paper, something else was happening in actual bodies, and this part isn't debatable. Globally, the number of people meeting criteria for metabolic syndrome, the cluster of excess weight, insulin resistance, and abnormal blood fats sitting underneath all three of these conditions, didn't inch upward, it exploded. From roughly 443 million people in the year 2000 to 154 billion by 2023. In the United States alone, obesity has roughly doubled since 1980. That is not a redefinition. Nobody in a committee room caused that. That's tens of millions of actual bodies changing. Across the exact same decades, these thresholds were being debated, which means the honest answer to the question this whole investigation is built around, was this manufactured, or was it real, is the answer nobody really wants, both at the same time, tangled together so tightly that separating them cleanly may not even be possible. Lower thresholds pulled in millions of borderline cases the old rules would have ignored entirely. At the same time, genuine insulin resistance was independently pushing real disease upward, driven by weight, inactivity, and age. How much of the 115 million belongs to each cause? That's still argued about inside medicine today. Nobody has a clean number for it, which leaves one question left, the only one that actually matters. If this happened to you, did any of it help? Did any of this save a single life? The honest answer splits three ways, depending on which file you're standing in. Blood pressure. The evidence holds up, at least for the higher risk patients. That trial and file, one actually tested. That drop in deaths we saw earlier. Real and significant for that specific group. Cholesterol. Statins consistently reduce cardiovascular events and modestly reduce deaths in people at meaningful risk. The 2013 shift toward personal risk scoring, instead of one number for everyone, was itself an attempt to aim treatment more precisely at the people who actually stood to benefit. Prediabetes, a different story entirely. No trial has ever shown that the label itself extends a life. What extends a life is the behavior change that sometimes follows it. The diagnosis was never the treatment, it was only ever the doorway. And there's a cost sitting on the other side of this ledger that's just as real. More diagnoses, more prescriptions, more side effects, more anxiety, more appointments for people who may never have developed actual disease at all. There's even a term for this inside medicine: overdiagnosis. Finding a condition that, left alone, would never have caused a symptom or shortened a life. It's a big enough concern that a major medical journal runs an entire campaign about it. It's real, and it's the legitimate price of casting a wider net. So, 31 million people with new hypertension, 115 million carrying a label for a disease most of them will likely never develop. What actually happened here? So, back to where we started. How do you produce 31 million new patients without a single one of them getting sicker? Here's the answer, and it's not the one either side of this argument wants. A diagnosis was never purely a biological fact, it's biology, filtered through a human decision about where to draw a line, and that line moves as trials, evidence, and understanding accumulate. Some of what happened across these three files is well supported. Real trial data, like the blood pressure study at the center of this investigation, shows that catching problems earlier and treating them more aggressively genuinely does save lives. In the right patients, some of it is reasonable, but still unproven. The belief that an earlier label helps people change course before real damage sets in, and some of it is genuinely unresolved. American thresholds more aggressive than most of the developed world was willing to adopt, decided by panels with more industry ties than an ideal, conflict-free process would allow. Underneath every part of it, undeniably real, an actual, measurable rise in obesity and insulin resistance. Across the exact same decades, these lines were being redrawn. So, no, this wasn't invented in a boardroom. And no, it isn't settled science, beyond question, either. It's a real biological shift and a genuine redefinition of disease, layered on top of each other so tightly that the researchers who studied this for a living still argue about how to pull them apart. If you've recently been told you're pre-diabetic, or that your blood pressure now technically qualifies as high, that label deserves your attention, not your panic. It doesn't mean your body changed overnight. It means you're being asked a fair question a little earlier than you would have been asked it a decade ago. What are you going to do next? That question, not the label, is where your actual outcome gets decided.